Hey there, Hang Up listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, SAP. Is your business reaching an exciting turning point? Are you ready to seize the moment for growth? Well, when you're facing tough decisions, SAP can help you be ready for anything that happens next. To learn more, head to sap.com/be-ready and stick around to hear how the president of an esports league seized the moment.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs.
Vic said something.
Music.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.
The following podcast contains explicit language. Hide your children. Hi, I'm Josh Levin, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of July 17th, 2023. On this week's show, we'll talk about Northwestern's decision to fire its football coach, Pat Fitzgerald, because of a hazing scandal. Sports Illustrated's John Wertheim will also be here to talk about Carlos Alcaraz's big win over Novak Djokovic at Wimbledon, whether there's just been a changing of the guard in men's tennis. And finally, the Washington Post's Sally Jenkins will be here to talk about her piece on the relationship between Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova and how it deepened when both were recently diagnosed with cancer. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Stefan Fatsis is mostly out this week. He's in Las Vegas scrabbling. Stefan, may you get good tiles and not lose all of your money playing Keno. With me for the first segment is Slate's Ben Mathis-Lilley. He's the author of The Hot Seat, A Year of Outrage, Pride, and Occasional Games of College Football. Ben famously lost all of his money betting on Michigan to cover against Ball State in 2006. Hello, Ben.
That was a tough game. It was a tough game that year. But, you know, I've gradually built it back.
Also here is a man who would never bet on sports because he has either too much or too little integrity. We're still trying to figure that out. It's the host of Slow Burn, Becoming Justice Thomas, Joel Anderson. Hello, Joel.
More like too little money, but yes, I don't have enough to gamble around like that, but something. Hey, you know what? Before I say hello here, is this the first time me and BML have been here since the fateful college football playoff semifinal? Is that the last time that we were on here together?
I think so. They were playing it the other night on one of the cable channels. It was a tough thing to see.
I had no way to know that was going to be the high point of TCU athletics for probably the next 5 to 10 years. But anyway, sorry it happened at your expense, BML.
You're going to beat up on Deion Sanders in the first week on national TV. I think that's pretty nice.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to that. That's one dub that I think that I'll particularly enjoy.
Joel, you know what we're looking forward to as consumers and Americans? Slow Burn Live in Washington, D.C. on July 25th. You got to sell the people. Why should they come to see you in D.C.? What are they going to get? Well,
I mean, just besides that I'm inconveniencing myself and family by flying across the country to be in D.C., I think we're going to have
that
really
is an amazing sales job.
Yeah, don't you think? Yeah, I mean, man, just you owe it to me, right? No, we're going to have some really good guests. Two of them that I can confirm right now. Eddie Jenkins. There's a little sports angle for some of the people that have listened to Slow Burn. Eddie Jenkins was Clarence Thomas's college friend who introduced him to his wife and also was a football star who later played for the 1972 Miami Dolphins. If you listen to the season, his voice, his comments, they stood out. And he's got some more fun stuff to talk about at the show. And we're also going to have Melissa Murray, who's an MSNBC commentator, a law professor, really fun person. I was just on the Strict Scrutiny podcast with her last week. And we're going to have a conversation with her and some other folks. And there are going to be some other guests. I don't want to get into all of that now, but, there'll be some famous, prominent people that are going to be there. And I'm not just saying it. So, I think it'll be fun. I might even try the Clarence Thomas shuffle. I'm going to bring a handkerchief and see if I can, maybe get that down. So there's reasons to show up, I think.
Slate.com/slowburnlive. to see Joel dance and to reward him for abandoning his family for a few days. That's slate.com/slowburnlive, July 25th, Washington, D.C. Slow Burn Live. I'll be there. In our bonus segment for Slate Plus members, Ben and Joel will stick around to talk about the demise of the NFL running back, what it would take to bring ball carriers back to their rightful place in the glorious game of American football. To hear that conversation, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on this show, on Slow Burn. I believe you get a discount on Slow Burn Live tickets if you're a Slate Plus member. You also get to listen to shows ad-free, a bunch of other great stuff, and you get to support us, which we appreciate. That is slate.com/hangupplus to sign up. A little more than a week ago, the president of Northwestern University announced that the school was suspending its football coach, Pat Fitzgerald, for 2 weeks without pay because of allegations of hazing in the program he'd led since 2006. Then the school newspaper, the Daily Northwestern, published an article in which a former player detailed those hazing rituals, which were essentially ritualized sexual abuse. And that was it for Pat Fitzgerald. Last Monday, the school president, Michael Schill, reversed course, firing the coach. Ben Fitzgerald was an institution at Northwestern. He was actually one of the longest tenured coaches in all of college football. So what do you make of the series of events that led to him getting axed last week?
So yeah, what I kind of find interesting about this is how it fits into the way we talk about sports as like a meritocracy, something with objective outcomes. Like, and Pat Fitzgerald was like kind of a hard-nosed, old-fashioned coach, and this is probably one of the things he would say about sports. You know, it's like you succeed or you fail. You know, and that's why some people like it. And in some sense, that's true. Like you can't argue about whether teams won or lost most of the time. But like this case, it really gets into the ways that, you know, that in some ways sports is not really a meritocracy. And in some cases, it's not just about winning or losing. So, which is to say that like Pat Fitzgerald as the head coach of Northwestern, like a lot of what his reputation was built on wasn't actually performance. Like his teams were pretty good sometimes, but they weren't always good. Like their offenses were really bad, like some of the worst in the country in recent years. But he had these like good defenses that could stop the run and offenses that tried to run the ball even if they couldn't. To get back to this scandal, like Pat Fitzgerald really had like a reputation that he leaned into for being like a throwback, like to the 70s or 80s or even earlier. Like he would talk about how he hated cell phones. His players tried to unionize, and he kind of like put that down because he felt like it was a challenge to his authority as this kind of like old fashioned coach. It's like his way or the highway kind of guy. Even stuff like that's a little less serious. He would complain about option offenses. And, you know, he talked about how they were like communism, like this is something he said a few years ago. But he really took on the mantle of being this like quote unquote hard nosed guy. And so I think in this scandal, what you see is like that being taken to an extreme of a culture inside of a football program that's like a little too old fashioned, and being a little too obsessed with doing things kind of an old way where like these kind of hazing rituals and you know, that bordered on cross the line into physical abuse were a little more common. And so you can kind of see that the way his personality and like the stuff that was completely outside the realm of what, you know, outside the lines of the field, like it seems to have taken on kind of a you know, it kind of curdled in a way and gotten kind of sick. And so I thought that was kind of my reaction to it happening. Like it wasn't that surprising that this kind of old school retrograde behavior scandal would happen in this kind of place because that was the kind of the environment he cultivated. I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Without naming names, I've listened to a lot of college football, you know, podcast shows over the last week or so that have actually come at it exactly and totally differently than you did, BML. They said, I could have never imagined that Pat Fitzgerald in Northwestern would have ever been involved in a scandal like this. So I'm like, what have you been looking at? What have you been paying attention to? Because you just right there, BML, came up with that very long laundry list of reasons for why it actually is not much of a surprise. Like Pat Fitzgerald wasn't some scholarly presence on the sideline like David Shaw at Stanford, right? Like his sales pitch was this lunkheadedness of the previous generation where he was, you know, the middle linebacker of probably the most prominent, most famous team in Northwestern football history, you're right. Fitzgerald's overall coaching record is barely above 500. So, yeah, you're right. It's not, what we would think of as a great record. But what's important to remember is the context through which Pat Fitzgerald came to prominence there is that he is the first and probably most important football star in Northwestern modern football history. They were on a team that went to the Rose Bowl, which I think was the first time, maybe in program history, but certainly the most in modern football history. And keep that in mind that, like you say, Pat Fitzgerald has a record barely above 500. Northwestern, after a generation of moderate success, they still rank 114th by winning percentage in the FBS. The only Power 5 schools with worse records are Wake Forest and Indiana.
Joel, Pat Fitzgerald, like we've been saying, was this kind of institution at Northwestern. There is this kind of period in Northwestern football history before him with Gary Barnett that was the kind of moment for that school, like where everybody loved Northwestern. They made it to the Rose Bowl. Pat Fitzgerald was an integral part of that team and that program.
Yeah, right. I mean, Gary Barnett is the guy that gets this school up off the mat. Prior to that, Northwestern is probably one of the biggest punchline, whatever you think of it, in college football history. It was pretty bad. But the one thing to remember about Gary Barnett, and this is where Pat Fitzgerald, learns about football at the college level. Like, he played for Gary Barnett and then later GA'd for him when his playing career was over. So this is the guy that set it up. Gary Barnett, he goes to Colorado, has some success there, and ultimately his career is undone. He was a fairly young guy, but his career was undone by a recruiting scandal that involved like alcohol, sex, and also they used to have a kicker on their team. He was one of the first female kickers in Division 1A football, Katie Hnida. And during the middle of this controversy, she accused one of her teammates of rape. And at some point in that scandal, Gary Barnett, as a way to discuss it publicly, said that she was a terrible kicker. So it's just a reminder that, Pat Fitzgerald, his football, the way that he came up in the game, he knows what it's like to watch a promising, prolific, winning football coach, his whole career be undone by something that was going on in the culture of the team. So it's just, this sort of stuff is cyclical, man. You have to sort of nip it in the bud, and you got to think about who these coaches' influences are and how they learn to run teams. Josh, BML, very rarely do guys like this in this position get to choose their own exit. And it's kind of funny that this is happening right around the same time that Bob Huggins is getting pushed out of West Virginia. But I just think about all the football coaches that kind of stick around a little bit too long, like the Paternos, the Bowdens, Frank Beamer, Woody Hayes, Mac Brown at Texas, and even at TCU, like, school where I was at. Gary Patterson there for about 20 years. And then after a while, people just take for granted that these programs don't run themselves. They need people there to actually run the programs and ensure that the culture doesn't rot.
Let's just go into the details of exactly what this anonymous player alleged. There's as I said in the introduction, a story in the Daily Northwestern, and there was this practice called running where it seems like typically freshmen were physically restrained by groups of upperclassmen wearing purge-like masks who would then begin dry humping the victims in a dark locker room. There are things like bear crawls where players are, again, freshmen forced to strip naked. There's something called the car wash where players were forced to go through this gauntlet of upperclassmen going into the showers where they have to rub against a naked man and then they're sprayed in the shower. There's, forcing guys to do a naked center quarterback exchange. And then there's this thing called a Gatorade shake challenge where they're forced to drink as many Gatorade shakes as they could in 10 minutes, which leads to, it seems like ritually, a lot of projectile vomiting. So I guess the question that was initially raised when there was this one of these classic white shoe law firm 6-month investigation reports, and it comes out, and that's when they decided to suspend Fitzgerald for 2 weeks. The initial question that the school president seemed to ask and answer is, how much did Pat Fitzgerald know? And it was, he didn't really know that much. He should have known, but 2 weeks, that seems like the right amount. And then when this more kind of detailed report in the school newspaper comes out, then the decision was made to axe him. But I guess, Joel, the question for you is, when you read about these hazing rituals, did it sound to you like, that's like a normal thing that happens in football programs, or maybe it's like a normal thing that happens in bad football programs? And also, what did you think about Pat Fitzgerald's culpability for what was going on in his program?
Yeah, I guess in terms of whether or not this sounds familiar to me, yeah. Maybe not, the to the extreme of the sexual abuse part of it, right? But I think every football program, bad, good, in between, they have some sort of traditions or rituals that involve, the younger players doing something at the request of the older players, right? So when I was at TCU, a generation ago, everybody came and rounded us up and made us get our hair cut. That was the thing. And some other, it was just like an aggressive haircut. Like they come out of your room, steal you out of there, hold you down and shave your head, right? And there may have been guys that when they fought back, there was other things that they had to do, but like it was just part of the thing. And my experience talking to other friends that went on and played college football at other places, they had to do something like that, maybe worse. Maybe they had to fight another teammate. Maybe they, got tied up outside to a goalpost, things like that. But it is, sort of a tradition of football, and you sort of have to accept it. And I think coaches give their players a lot of discretion in that way because they want the players to like lead the locker room, come up with the hierarchy, come up with, a system where we all feel, beholden to one another, right? That the locker room is sacred in that way. But to your second question, Josh, like what Pat Fitzgerald should have known or didn't know, I always kind of go back and forth on that. But this is what I say. Pat Fitzgerald, from what we know, this is Northwestern as a private institution, makes at or more than $5 million a year. Well, maybe he didn't know, right? But like to me, that says, well, I mean, this is what the money is for, bro. You get to take credit for the culture of the program when it does well, when you're trotting out players that are academic All-Americans, things like that. But if you're not going to be connected to your locker room, then that in itself is a problem. If you didn't have an understanding of what was going on in there, then like obviously you need to get somebody in there that does. Everybody knows that the stakes are too high at this point, that you can't be totally removed from what these players are doing. And furthermore, like even it's like just competition wise, like it's a bad idea to not have a connection to the people in the locker room, your locker room leaders, and have some sort of sense of this. So probably my thought on that is that, okay, I don't want to be too reckless here. Pat Fitzgerald, if I had to guess, knowing my experience of other college football coaches, had some idea about it, but probably didn't think it was a big deal. And if that's the case, then it's no wonder why they had to move on from there, because you need somebody in that role to get to the bottom of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm curious what your guys' reaction to this is. But one thought I had when I was reading some of these initial accounts, as I kind of mentioned before, like it really reminded me of like the kind of thing that would happen in like in a high school or something in the like decades ago, and just like a place that is old fashioned and is not up to date like we expect college football programs to be today. Like I just had a hard time picturing it actually happening in like the $1 million locker rooms that we all talk about. And so I'm curious what you guys think, but like I actually can't imagine, and this is like famous last words, I could be wrong, but I can't imagine this happening at a place where the stakes are even higher, like an Alabama or Ohio State. And I'm not saying that because I'm, Nick Saban or Ryan Day are better people. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But just like, this is kind of like, this is kind of like Bush League shit. You know what I mean? And it's like, and it kind of made sense to me that it would happen at a place like where Northwestern, where, like obviously it's very important. Football is very important, but like I just couldn't picture one of these kind of like super detail oriented alpha coaches letting that go on and kind of waste his time and his players' time at a bigger program.
Do you don't think this could happen under Jim Harbaugh? Because actually, I kind of do think it could happen under Jim Harbaugh.
Well, I intentionally didn't bring that, didn't say Michigan because I don't want to be a homer. But yeah, I mean, sure, like I have no reason to think that it does, of course. Like I don't think that there's been any hint of an allegation in that way. But there are some overlaps, of course, between a lot of the ways that a lot of these Midwestern coaches actually kind of present themselves as old fashioned in some ways. So, another thing I was going to bring up is that like there's like a very strong overlap with a second set of allegations about racism within Northwestern's program. And what was said about the Iowa program a few years ago under Kirk Ferentz, who's another one of these kind of like 50 to 60-year-old hard-nosed old-fashioned football coaches. So no, I think that it would be kind of crazy to rule it out and say, oh, it couldn't happen in these places. But like, I just think some of these other operations are so professionalized and there's so many people around them that it's hard for me to picture. But,
well, Ben, the school that has recently had a big scandal and the coach who was, revered in some circles and had been there for decades and just left under a cloud is Harvard women's hockey, where there were all these allegations about hazing and naked skates and all of this stuff. And The Athletic did really good reporting on it. And then I guess another example is Northwestern baseball, where the coach just left or was pushed out within the last week around allegations of mistreating players, being verbally abusive, making inappropriate comments about a female staff member. And so, I think the part that I would agree with is that Northwestern is this private school. It's harder for them to, they've made excuses around, it's harder for us to compete now because of the transfer portal, because of the admissions department. But like, speaking more broadly, I think there's this sense with a coach like Pat Fitzgerald, we have huge institutional challenges here. We can't get the same caliber of player. We need to be tougher. Mm-hmm. We need to be, we can't, have the same kind of loosey-goosey attitude that maybe you can get away with at Ohio State, where you have a superior athlete. And then that gets into like what we saw at Iowa as well, this idea that, if you're a black player in particular, you have to conform, you have to get your hair cut, you have to, go with the Northwestern way. There's this sort of like top-down idea, my way or the highway sort of idea that I think all of this stuff falls under. Do you agree with that, Joel?
Yeah, I definitely think that is a piece of it, right? That I'm glad we all brought up the racism piece here, because it tends to be overlooked and buried among all this stuff. It's like, oh, well, we're sort of used to these guys being racist around them.
But credit to the Daily Northwestern, too, because when they did that first piece, they didn't stop. They came out with another story on Monday with allegations, with some actually named former players, about allegations of racism. And, you were a college newspaper guy, too, Joel. I think you reported on the football program.
I did. And it's very uncomfortable, especially there's not a lot of institutional support for student newspapers as a rule. And so the fact that they were able to do this about, the most famous Northwestern alum that I can think of, I don't know, maybe Julia Louis-Dreyfus. I don't know if she's relevant, but for them to taking on that program and that guy, like, that says something. But let me ask you all this question, because I think about this every time this happens at like Baylor or Penn State or whatever. And why do schools want to do this? I know that the money is compelling, right? But the money usually just goes back into the operation itself. It's not like because Northwestern football tends to do well that like the whole other institution is benefiting in some sort of way. And so like they have this new president, a guy who came from the University of Oregon. He spent his whole life working at Penn, NYU, UCLA, University of Chicago, and he gets to Northwestern and possibly his job is going to be in peril because of a football program that isn't even that good anyway. It's like, what do these schools get out of this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I guess I just don't understand why it always ends up here. And I'm like, well, you didn't have to do this. Like, does Northwestern really suffer that much reputationally compared to University of Chicago if they've de-emphasized football? I know that that's not going to happen. I know that that's an unrealistic like avenue, but I'm always just like, surely this academic who takes over one of the best schools in the country gets here and he has to deal with this. And it must just feel like, what the fuck are we doing here?
Well, I talked to a few people about this kind of subject for my book. And I think you're getting at one of the big incentives there, which is that like these presidents don't want, usually in most cases, to be associated with scandal, especially at a place like Northwestern. And I think that, just to speculate a little, might have something to do with why Pat Fitzgerald has been fired and why Kirk Ferentz at Iowa is still coaching Iowa. I do think you're right. There are like some differing incentives depending on what school you're at. And of course, recent record, like you're totally right to say that Pat Fitzgerald was the most successful coach in Northwestern history. But that said, the last three of the last 4 seasons, they were awful. So I think that plays into it too. But I mean, to answer your bigger question, like, it's pride. I mean, it's like, because these things make people feel good about who they are and who their school is. I mean, we mentioned TCU in the intro, like, probably felt pretty good last fall, right? Like, like
you don't tweet every Saturday about like all the stories on the TCU student newspaper, Joel. Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, it's
well, I mean, I tweet about how bad University of Texas is, regardless. That's not going to change. So that could be that big one.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like when the highs are pretty high. And I guess that would be my answer. Like, I don't think it's any more complicated than that. Like, cause like, hey, when Northwestern was going to the Rose Bowl, like everyone, Julie Louis-Dreyfus, David Schwimmer, all these Northwestern people, like all the lawyers and bankers and whatever who went to Northwestern, like they felt pretty good. And like in those years. And like they felt special, when their team was doing well. And I think that's, after having thought about it for like my entire life, like, why do we do this? Like, I think that it really is just the reason. Like, when you're winning, it feels good. And that's about it.
And I believe there's like a $multi-$100 million athletic complex infrastructure project going on at Northwestern right now. And I would also say, Joel, to your one comment about institutional support in school newspapers, very broadly true, but the one school in the country where the power dynamic between the school newspaper and the football team isn't what you'd expect is probably Northwestern.
That's right.
Fair point.
All right, Joel, Ben, you'll be back for our bonus segment, but for now, goodbye.
See you, man. Good to be here.
Later.
Up next, a passing of the torch, maybe, in men's tennis. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the more than 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right. Everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously though, see terms and check out for yourself at discover.com/match. On Sunday at Wimbledon, 36-year-old Novak Djokovic was going for his 5th straight Wimbledon title and 8th Wimbledon overall, a victory that would give him a record-extending 24th major, and given that he'd already won the Australian and French Opens this year, keep his chances alive for the first calendar Grand Slam in men's tennis since Rod Laver did it in 1969. Standing in his way was a 20-year-old playing in his 4th ever grass court tournament. The trouble for Djokovic was that 20-year-old was Carlos Alcaraz. And over 5 sets, Alcaraz confirmed that he is who we thought he might be, smashing and slicing and drop-shotting his way over and through the man who we all believed, at least as of Sunday morning, was the best player in the world. Joining me now is Sports Illustrated executive editor and senior writer John Wertheim. You can see him on 60 Minutes when he's not on Tennis Channel. He's also the author of the book Strokes of Genius, Federer, Nadal, and the Greatest Match Ever, about the 2008 Wimbledon men's final. John, thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure. And that was a terrific intro. I don't know what is left for me to say.
I want to start really big here, John. You were there on Sunday. You wrote the book on the 2008 final when Nadal shook the tennis world by taking down Federer on grass. Did Alcaraz, Djokovic feel like that kind of moment?
It had those echoes. It had those vibes, as the kids say. It really did. And not just sort of Spanish kings behind the baseline. It really had this cliche alert changing of the guard vibe. And it was a 5-setter, and the victor was a clay court newbie who has been making fast strides. The match in 2008, it was 1 versus 2. The match in 2008, I think, was more sort of traditional as drama. I mean, yesterday was a very strange match just in terms of rhythms and the first, at 6-1 sets. So I think the quality from a drama perspective was pretty high in both cases, but I think in 2008 it may have been a bit higher. But no, I mean, to your question, it's a good point. It had a lot of the same sorts of feelings and, a 5-set match, 1 versus 2, the winner from Spain, a lot of parallels you could draw.
And I think another parallel I would say is that in 2008, we knew Nadal was great, but this was a kind of extension of his greatness. And the idea that he was greater than we thought, nobody could conquer Federer on grass. We knew Nadal was great on clay. And in this case, I think we all knew that Alcaraz was the next big thing. He'd won the U.S. Open when Djokovic wasn't there for vaccination reasons. He has been great on clay. But like I said in the intro, this was somebody who had never really played that much on grass. He won the warm-up tournament, but a warm-up tournament isn't Wimbledon. But this match, John, it kind of confirmed that not just that he's here now at 20, but maybe that even though we thought he was great, that he is greater and can be greater than we even imagined he could be.
This was the Maya Angelou of tennis. Believe people the first time they reveal their character. No, I think this was a real confirmation. And again, when he won the U.S. Open, he was 19 years old. He was this electric player, but he did not have to go through one of the big three, particularly the member of the big three who is still very much in his prime. So for him, not only to win Wimbledon, this was only his 10th major. He's won 2 of them already. And we can also talk about how 5 weeks ago he got to the semis of the French facing the same opponent and wilted on account of what he called tension. For him to come back and not only win the tournament, but to stare down the mighty Novak Djokovic in the final. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this was a confirmation of him. This was a confirmation of everything we've been saying for the past 18 months. And a couple of points. This was really a close match that hinged on a couple of sort of bad decisions and critical points. But all of a sudden, the tennis story has changed to, is Novak Djokovic on the downslide and is this guy the new king? He really sort of is ranked number 1 and just beat the biggest challenger in tennis. I mean, beating Novak Djokovic in a best-of-5 match is the greatest challenge, and this kid came through.
There are, I think, 3 moments when a mortal player would have wilted in that match. Why don't you pick the one that stands out to you? The 3 that I think of are the second set tiebreak, the 27-minute game in the third set, and then the 5th set when, as Djokovic kind of alluded to in his post-match on-court statement, like the great Roger Federer had him down match points and moments in Grand Slam finals, but Alcaraz, he had to, step up to the line and serve it out against Djokovic in that final game of the match.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I would add to that just the macro that, again, barely 5 weeks earlier, he plays Djokovic, same thing. It's 1 versus 2. It has all this context, this supremacy on the line. They play great for 2 hours, and then he goes into full body cramp mode. It was like the MMA fighter that just kind of freezes up and gasses out. And he comes back on Sunday and he loses the first set 6-1 in 34 minutes. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this scar tissue from Roland Garros, this kid's never going to get over it. Another critical point, I think the 3 you named were quite good. And again, he got an early break in the 5th set, so he had to serve it out. He had to hold serve his last three or four times. But I just think sort of the bigger picture of you play this great towering titan of tennis, Novak Djokovic, who is known for his mental strength. He wins a mental battle against you at the French Open. At the very next major tournament, he wins the first set 6-1. It almost humiliates you. And for him to turn it around and then win 3 of the next 4 sets, I think was really revealing. But yeah, I mean, they played more than 300 points, but you can pinpoint 3 or 4 moments, as you just did really well, that were really pivotal.
Watching on TV, I'm curious if you felt the same thing. It struck me that in the first set, Alcaraz was demonstrating or trying to demonstrate his ability to hit winners, his power. Probably has kind of the most impressive forehand in terms of pace, angle, and all of that in the entire sport. And Djokovic is the best retriever, best defender, especially on grass in men's tennis. And the thing that so impressed me is that I felt like from the second set on, Alcaraz kind of played like Djokovic plays, that he actually dialed it down a little bit. And instead of, as a 20-year-old, being like, I'm just going to hit the ball harder, or like a lot of players do against Djokovic, I'm just going to try to, hit every single line because this guy can get to anything. It just seemed like he was kind of able and content to out-rally Novak, that he used a lot of variety and a lot of kind of intelligence and guile, with obviously the occasional just like screamer mixed in. But it didn't seem like that first set either stressed him out like mentally or emotionally, or it didn't seem like it really led him to go for too much. And I thought that was incredibly impressive.
I think that's a really good point. He sort of out-Djokovic. And you're right. Usually the temptation, you lose the first set to Djokovic, and your temptation is just go for broke and start throwing haymakers. And it never tends to end well. And I think you're right. This was sort of the opposite. He used his slice, which is not as powerful a shot as his backhand drive. He used the slice a lot more in sets 2, 3, 4, 5 than he did in the first set. And his coach before the French Open, I spent a few days in Spain at the academy where he trains, and Juan Carlos Ferrero, former player, is his coach, and obviously sort of picked the right horse. But one thing he said is that he's still a kid in the sense that he's not irresponsible. He shows up on time. But one thing he does, he sort of goes for these highlight reel shots. And sometimes he goes for the spectacular, he goes for the 360 dunk when he can just lay the ball in. And he really dialed back those instincts. And he also has that drop shot that is so effective. And it's sort of fun, and then the crowd likes it. But it's really a strategic shot because it totally changes the positioning, and it gives him this opportunity to win points with touch as well as power. I thought you're right, Josh. I think really almost he outplayed Djokovic, and he kind of outthought him, strange as that is to say.
Yeah, he missed a drop shot to go down love 15 in that final service game, and then he went back to the drop shot the next point, which if it hadn't worked, I think we would have been like, all right, like he's lost his mind, like, you gotta, what are you doing in that situation? So a lot of times, I guess we think you're smart if you execute what exactly it is that you're trying to do, but he certainly had the guts to do it and to stick with it in a moment when the like fine motor control and the touch in a really nervy game is something that's probably you're gonna lose, but he didn't lose it. And also just, I have to say, nice flex on saying that you were just hanging out with him, right before the tournament, just drop that in. I like that. He said, John, after the match, I've grown up a lot since the French Open, which I guess in terms of proportion of his life, since he's only 20, I guess 5 weeks can feel like a long time. But, he is just, he seems like very sincere, very winning. And I don't know if it was particularly galling to Djokovic, who had his usual like drama with the crowd during the match, that like this guy instantly comes on the scene and is beloved by crowds around the world. And Djokovic, as the winningest player ever, still seems like he can't get the love when he wants it and needs it.
I would submit that cracking your racket on the center court net post, the sort of sacred shrine of tennis, and in the fifth set, smashing your racket and potentially injuring yourself in the process is not always a way to endear yourself to a crowd. But no, I think you're right. First of all, I always have the same irony as you. Oh, I've been dreaming about this moment all your life. You're like, dude, you were born in 2003. That's what he kept saying. I've improved a lot my mental strength since the French Open. You're like, that was not like June 10th. But you're right, as a proportion. But no, I also... You do feel at some level for Djokovic. Here's this guy, he's trying to win this thing. He's trying to go for his fifth straight Wimbledon title. He hadn't lost on center court in a decade. He'd just gotten done at the previous major setting the all-time record. And he comes out here and the fans are like 85-15 for the other guy. But I do think Djokovic did not help his cause with some of his, fuel by tension outbursts. But yeah, I mean, the other thing, too, is Alcaraz is just such an endearing guy. I mean, he plays well with the older set. He's sort of from the Nadal school of full respect to everyone. There's no imaginable controversy with this guy. But I think the crowd actually played a pretty big role yesterday, especially in that fifth set. It was so palpable who, again, 9 out of 10 fans wanted to win. And I think given what we know about Djokovic and sort of given what we know about the 20-year-old brain, I think the crowd gets an assist for getting this kid past the line.
So I think it was John McEnroe, or it was one of the Fowler-McEnroe trio after the match, was saying, thinking about tennis in terms of generations, like, so many guys have tried to break through against the big three. I mean, if you count Andy Murray, this is the first win for somebody not in the big four since Leighton Hewitt in 2002 at Wimbledon. I mean, it's insane. Like, it's generations of guys have tried and failed to break through. And they were talking about, well, maybe, Sinner had a match point against Alcaraz at the U.S. Open last year. And they have this kind of amazing, like, nascent rivalry. Like, Tiafoe obviously went 5 with Alcaraz at the U.S. Open last year as well. And you have this whole kind of group of players that maybe could look at this and have hope and think, oh, if he can do it, I can too. I'm not sure I actually agree with that, because I think Alcaraz has, just in his very short career, shown that he is better than those players. I mean, is it better in the same way that like Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal are better? I don't know if it's like that kind of chasm, but I wonder what your kind of instinct is there. Do you think that Sinner or Tiafoe or any number of other guys watch this and be like, I'm going to win Grand Slams now too? Or they're like, shit, like, all right, I guess we got to lose to this guy now.
Athletes are very good at deluding themselves and telling themselves stories. And yeah, I was really inspired watching him play. And I said, hey, if Carlos can do it, why not me? But I think realistic. Djokovic is 36. Josh, listen to this. There is one player younger than he is who has won multiple majors, and that is now Carlos Alcaraz. So there's there's 15 years worth of players that barely got a sniff. And now here comes this 20-year-old. And some of this is data, and you look at sort of the way he plays and the way he plays the big points and the miles per hour on serve. And some of this is just the eye test and the way he serves out Novak Djokovic in the fifth set of Wimbledon final. I mean, Roger Federer didn't do that a few years ago. I think, a lot can happen. He plays a very physical style, and you worry about injuries. I mean, there are a lot of variables here, but I think looking at this objectively, there is a pretty wide chasm right now between Carlos Alcaraz and any other player on the planet not named Novak Djokovic.
I mean, so the issue with this is a potential rivalry, and why it feels more like a generational shift than the start of something is you got a 20-year-old and a 36-year-old. This isn't like Federer, Nadal. Yeah. It's not like Nadal, Djokovic. I guess it's more like Federer, Sampras at Wimbledon. But we do have the U.S. Open. That was what was so remarkable at this. Like, Djokovic didn't particularly show weakness in this final, John. He would have beaten any other player in the world and would be going into the U.S. Open, going for the calendar slam. So, I mean, it seems like it's great for tennis in the short term to look forward to potentially having this in New York, and maybe next year too. Like, Djokovic after the match was like saying crazy things. He's like saying, I've never played anyone like this guy before. Like, Nadal and Federer had their strengths and weaknesses. I mean, he's playing it up. He's basically saying, yeah, this guy is as good as you all think he is.
I think Djokovic comes to the U.S. Open very motivated. And again, athletes are very good at telling themselves stories. And if Djokovic wants to tell himself, this 20-year-old is my new rival, and if that's something that keeps him motivated, that's great. But I also think, Federer, whatever, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, was who's going to come? Roger Federer has a supremacy, and it's a huge gap between him and the rest of the field. And then, these two guys came along, and they knew how high the bar was, and they knew what they had to do, and they could even tailor their games to take down Federer. And by and large, they did it. So who knows? I mean, maybe Jannik Sinner or Holger Rune or Francis Tiafoe, maybe one of these guys absolutely sort of sets their sights on taking down the mighty Alcaraz. But no, I mean, tennis is sort of in this funny place now where we just got out of, you were sort of at the tail end, the dying embers of this great big three era. And then here comes this other guy who looks pretty unbeatable. We were joking. We said, if this guy, if he wins Australia, the final major, the final task will be for this Spanish kid who grew up on clay to win Roland Garros. So you figure if he could beat Novak Djokovic in the Wimbledon final, Lord knows what kind of damage he can do over the next 10 or 15 years in Paris.
I mean, there was this kind of like generation of players like Milos Raonic where it was just like clear they had no chance. But I think maybe the guys that this is the hardest on would probably be like the Tsitsipas Zverev mini generation. I mean, Medvedev already has one.
Yeah.
But it's like, if Sinner and Rune and those guys can get some hope from this, like for Medvedev, Tsitsipas, Zverev, we're like kind of just waiting. We're waiting our turn. These guys are so old. We're like getting to all the finals. They're like, they've just all been surpassed at this point. And just a brief word about the women's final. I mean, the thing that I was thinking about there with Ons Jabeur losing to Vondrousova is like Ons has made 3 of the last 5 finals. I was just like watching the new episodes of Breakpoint, the Netflix series, and just how much she wanted to win Wimbledon. And it just seemed like narratively like this was her time to do it. I mean, these things are so hard to win, John. Like, I hate to say this, and I don't mean to cast aspersions. She played so badly in that final compared to her level. The pressure was just so immense. And like, she just seems like such a great person. I really wanted her to win. Just so hard to win these. But some players, whether it's Djokovic or now Alcaraz, actually like make it look perversely easy. That just must be so galling or so, I don't know what it is, but it's just this funny kind of dichotomy in the sport where like some guys are just able to make the impossible look just not that hard.
Your tennis hot take, I would say Nick Kyrgios is the best thing that happened to the big three because he is, abundantly talented and has zero work ethic. And it's kind of given the lie to the myth that, Roger was touched by the gods. You're like, no, if Roger were simply touched by the gods, he'd be Nick Kyrgios. Clearly, there is a lot of labor and a lot of practice that we're not seeing. And I think the same thing happened this weekend, where we take it for granted that, Novak he's a mental lock. And you say, well, you know what? Not every player is. And we got a pretty vivid demonstration of how easy it can be to freeze up on these big stages. I think sort of what happened in the women's final in a way put what Carlos Alcaraz did into sharp relief, because we see that even very accomplished players who have won their previous 6 rounds and really want to win these things can freeze up. And it was kind of excruciating to watch, exactly for the reason you said. I mean, in a vacuum, it would have been hard to watch a player reach the final and then absolutely sort of have what, I saw one journalist, something may have been lost in translation, but they said it was a panic attack. It would have been hard enough to watch a player get to the Wimbledon final and barely be able to hit the ball in the court and see their level precipitously drop. But the fact that it's this otherwise absolutely lovely human being who really wants this made it doubly excruciating. But I also think it did kind of give us an illustration of just how remarkable it was for Alcaraz and Djokovic too, what he's done over the last 15 years to somehow subdue their nerves and bring their best tennis to these big matches.
And Marketa Vondrousova had done absolutely nothing on grass. So maybe we can just discount that in the future as a factor. John Wertheim writes for Sports Illustrated. You can watch him on 60 Minutes and on Tennis Channel. And he is the author of the book Strokes of Genius, Federer, Nadal, and the Greatest Match Ever Played. Strokes of Genius 2, coming to bookstores. Maybe never. I don't know.
We'll need a little better access. Just kidding. No, but it was a pleasure to have been there and pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks, John. Up next, Sally Jenkins on Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova, and surprise, Stefan Fatsis. We'll be back with the introduction in moments. There is no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform you need to build yours. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed is a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. Indeed streamlines hiring with powerful tools that find you matched candidates. With Instant Match, more than 80% of employers get quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job, according to Indeed Data US. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/hangup. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/hangup. Just go to Indeed.com/hangup and support the show by saying you heard about it on this podcast. Indeed.com/hangup. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and SAP. How do you know when to seize the moment for growth? When your opportunity arrives, you need to be ready. From expanding into new markets to hiring, business leaders face so many tough decisions.
My name is Brendan Donahue, president of the NBA 2K League. The NBA 2K League is a professional esport run by the NBA and 2K, where we take 30 million people who play the game of NBA 2K and we find the best 125 in the world to compete in our league.
In March of 2020, the start of the pandemic spurred the league to take steps it never imagined. And with SAP tools, they knew they were ready.
We could have postponed our season like a lot of other sports leagues did. We decided to seize the moment. We created a competition that could be done virtually. We had the NBA 2K League on major sports networks for 17 weeks. That moment gave us a chance to talk to a mass audience across the world. So the majority of our fans, less than 1%, will ever step foot in an NBA arena to watch a game live. But you have this significant fandom and excitement for the game, and so that's really where we think we play a role. Our first season, we had 650,000 people watch our finals in season 1. Now our finals this past year, we had 2.2 million people watching.
NBA 2K League seized the moment for growth. Will you? Head to sap.com/be-ready to learn more.
From 1973 to 1988, Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova played each other 80 times, 60 in tournament finals. Chrissy versus Martina was a story of absurd dominance and of media-friendly contrasts. Evert portrayed as the All-American princess, Navratilova as the Eastern European interloper. The late tennis luminary Bud Collins called it the rivalry of the century. During their careers, Evert and Navratilova's personal relationship was up and down. Up when Evert was winning at the start, down when Martina asserted control in the mid-'80s, and up again as the players neared the end of their careers and beyond. The latest chapter is the most dramatic. Evert and Navratilova, both diagnosed with cancer last year, leaning on each other throughout. Our friend Sally Jenkins wrote about their shared ordeal in a beautiful and deeply reported story last week in the Washington Post, where she is a sports columnist. Sally also has a new book out, The Right Call: What Sports Teach Us About Work and Life. Hey, Sally, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start with the tennis. 18 Grand Slam titles apiece, 12 years in a row where one or the other finished number one. They won 19 of 20 slams in one stretch in the 80s. Sally, you started your sports writing career when they were at their peak. Help those who weren't around understand just how great Chris and Martina were on the court compared to the rest of the field.
Well, one of the things I did when I was reporting this piece was go back and look at some of their best matches, and I could not believe how the quality of the tennis holds up. even matches that they were playing with wooden rackets, in like 1981, they're still playing with wood. You just can't believe the quality of the exchanges. They use the entire court, serve and volley versus baseliner, but yet they were much more complete players than just that. And at the same time, they're both achieving superstar status and fighting for equal pay in women's tennis and growing the sport. I like to call them Evertilova because my view is that they didn't win 18 Grand Slams apiece. They won 36 Grand Slams collectively, which is miles away from the all-time record. And the fascinating fact is that they had to win so many of those Grand Slam titles against each other, right? I mean, I don't know of any other great champion who had to play an opponent of such quality to win a Grand Slam title as Evert did playing Navratilova and Navratilova did playing Chris Evert.
I just want to echo what Stefan said about the piece, Sally. It's really incredibly well reported. The interviews are great, but your prose is also amazing. And just the insights that you were able to wring out of them and find in their relationship were just really fantastic. And the part that really struck me was that in a sense, for both of them, actually not being friends was a kind of political statement in a way, that they were showing the world that women could be as fierce as men could on the court. And for Evert in particular, not having relationships with other players was kind of a key to the edge that she sort of felt that she had. And so how did they navigate the fact that they were bringing women's sports to this entirely new level with their competitive nature, with the kind of pull that they felt toward each other?
People don't really think of Chris Evert as a revolutionary, but she was. And that's one of the underpinnings of the piece. Chrissy is the one who really made it okay to compete so fiercely and yet be so feminine. That was new, right? That was a new thing. It was as new in a way as Navratilova's athleticism. No one had ever seen a woman athlete move with the kind of acrobatic athletic ease that Navratilova did at the net. But nobody had ever seen a woman compete with the kind of mental intensity and unforgivingness, if you will, that Chris Evert did. So they were, flip sides of a coin in some ways, but both of them gave permission to women to compete, as Chrissy puts it in the piece, absolutely to the ends of the earth to achieve something.
And what's really striking as you sort of recount their relationship and the evolution of it, Sally, is the tension that moved back and forth as the players evolved as competitors. Chris had the advantage at the start. She was there first. She was 2 years older. Navratilova, you described with some lovely scenes, her early moments in the United States. She was granted, I didn't remember this. She was granted this 8-week permission to leave Czechoslovakia and come and play. And you described this first encounter between the two of them when, for Chris, who was already established at 18, had already won majors, meeting this brash 16-year-old. Tell us about that and how the early years of their relationship developed.
Well, first of all, you guys are absolutely right that, the relationship was ridden with tension. It wasn't all easy and it wasn't all lovey-dovey. They did have periods of estrangement. They did have periods of, I describe it as an hourglass. They start out from opposite ends of the world. They come together as friends, as teenagers, mainly because of Chrissy's generosity, spiritual generosity, welcoming this kid from behind the Iron Curtain who was, on this 8-week grant of leave from the Iron Curtain. And then Chrissy is one of the few people who knows that Navratilova is going to defect at the 1975 U.S. Open. In fact, Chris, when they played their match at the Open, knew that as soon as it was over, Martina was going into New York and putting herself in the protection of the FBI. So there's a drama to their early relationship when they're 16 and 18 years old and then moving forward into womanhood and maturity that, early Chrissy is protective of Martina, generous to her. And then Martina defects, acquires some stability in her life, regains her emotional equilibrium after the trauma of leaving her family behind and learning English. And Martina starts nipping at her heels and Chrissy couldn't handle it. And Chrissy herself will say that she could not handle being friends and competitors at that level. She thought it cost her her competitive edge and that she had become too fond of Martina and it was hurting her on the court. And so they move into these very icy periods in their primes. But by 1985, they're fully mature women. They are beginning to realize that their rivalry is a joint accomplishment. And they have spent so much time in locker rooms, just the two of them before finals, in all that tension. And they have spent so much time being caricatured in the press and pitted against each other stereotypically, that they have come to this private understanding and a private affection, that only grows deeper over the coming years until they reach this point where they're dealing with cancer together. And it's extraordinary. Mary Carrillo, our great mutual friend and tennis broadcaster, is the one who told me on the phone one day a few months ago, they've never been closer. She said, it's an unbelievable relationship. They've never been closer than they are right now. And that's what made me, ask them if they would be willing to do this piece. And one of the things that you learn sitting in a room with them is that there is so much unspoken stuff between them, so much unspoken understanding. And I think that one of the pieces of that unspoken understanding is the price they paid for those careers. They sacrificed their families to it, their marriages. Chrissy lost a couple of marriages to it. Martina lost, I think, 5 or 6 years of being able to see her family to it. They fulfilled every ounce of promise and ambition, but it came at a very heavy personal price. And the only people who truly understand the price is her, the other one.
That's really well said. And it wasn't just Chris who decided at a certain point that being friends with Martina made her lose her competitive edge. When Nancy Lieberman comes into Martina's life, and Nancy Lieberman is a whole other piece in herself, just a completely fascinating and important character in American sports history. Nancy Lieberman becomes a major part of Martina's life and convinces her, you
have to hate this woman. Yeah.
And you have an amazing scene in there of Nancy Lieberman turning her back on Chris and snubbing her. I mean, it's amazing stuff.
Yeah, very catty, right? Yeah.
I guess I wonder, were they right about that? Were they losing their competitive edge on the court by being friends? Or looking back on it, were they wrong? And could they have remained friends and still had these fierce battles with each other? Because when you look at, I'm curious for your thoughts. It seems to me like Martina surpassed Chris, winning 30 of their last 40 matches just because she became a better player. It wasn't because Chris was friends with her or anything like that. I'm wondering what you think and if you had any sense of what they think.
Yeah.
Do they regret those moments when they decided they couldn't be close anymore?
They would tell you that even when the people around them were egging them on, that they very quietly, I think, didn't like it. Neither one of them was ultimately that comfortable with it, whether it was Jimmy Evert convincing his daughter, you can't be friends with these people, or whether it was Nancy Lieberman saying, look, you have to hate her. I think as younger women, they fell into that and believed it. And then as the rivalry wore on, they realized that they did not have to do that. And very quietly, Martina would tell you, look, even at our worst, Chrissy never did anything to really rub it in. There was not one moment. Chrissy, this is a lovely statement. Chris said, not one moment in all those years in the locker room after a match when someone had won and someone had lost, did the loser say, you know what? I can't talk to you right now. Leave me alone. She said that never happened. They had a kindness for each other in defeat, a compassion for each other in defeat that kind of won out over those people trying to pit them against each other, and when they were really mature women in their late 20s, they understood that. And that's when they made this private agreement. Look, we'll come to each other first. We're going to talk to each other directly. We're not going to let surrogates, in our camps do this anymore.
I thought an observation that you made and that Chris and Martina both make is fascinating about how you write, in its way, Everett's childhood was as stifling as Martina's own had been in Czechoslovakia. You quote Martina saying, we are much more the same than different. So much of it was imposed on both of us one way or the other, with her Catholic proper girl upbringing and me being suppressed by communism. I wondered, is that a thought that they reached later in their careers, after their careers, only recently? Or is it something that they recognized fairly early on Or was it like they didn't recognize it, but they were drawn together because for this reason, they were kindred spirits?
I believe that's wholly Martina's reflection. That was an astonishing statement that, I didn't write that. She said that. And then I took it from there. Chrissy agrees with it, I think. I think it's one of those things that they arrived at in late night phone calls in retirement. I think when they were playing, they didn't have a lot of room for a whole lot of psychological investigation. Great champions at their peak actually don't want to do that kind of investigation. But I do think it was part of their kindred spirit. They had a natural empathy for each other. I think Martina knew that Chrissy felt straitjacketed by the whole public persona and by her father and the way she had been reared. But I don't think that's something they really hashed out, at the peak of the rivalry. I think that Chrissy certainly knew about Martina needing to defect and needing to find some freedom in her life in order to play tennis and also in order to find love in her life, and so they knew those things about each other, but I don't think those are things that they really sat around talking about deep into the night in like 1984. I think those are things that came later.
The great tennis rivalry of more recent years is Federer and Nadal, which has had its own kind of ups and downs on the court. Federer kind of similarly to Evert, having come along sooner, winning all the titles, and then having Nadal kind of take it away from him, and Federer not really being able to deal with it very well. And then kind of at the back half of their careers, I think they always had a respect for each other, but, Federer turned the rivalry around a bit, winning 5 of the last 6. And then when Federer retires, the moment on the court where they're both crying. And I think they now understand, if they didn't always, how deeply they needed each other and that they meant to each other, and that Rafa's wife is about to have a baby, but comes there because, obviously he has to be there with Roger leaving. So there's that kind of sports mortality and the amount of emotions that it brings up. But with Chris and Martina, you have actual mortality. Mm-hmm. And the part that was so touching is how gutted they both were for each other. Yeah. I think it was Martina just sobbing when she heard first that Chris was diagnosed, and then that Chris, because she has breast cancer gene, was going to get a double mastectomy, and how that was just so devastating for Martina. So can you just share a little bit about the depth of feeling that they had for each other as they were going through these diagnoses?
Well, Martina sobbed on the phone telling me the story. And actually, Chrissy, when I first got Chrissy on the phone to sort of propose the story and start sort of talking it through, I said, what do you love about Martina? Why are you guys still this close? What do you love about her? And she said, oh God, I think I'm going to cry, and then she did. They get tearful about the friendship. Rafa and Federer, that's a beautiful rivalry and obviously a friendship. But those guys only played a handful of times. It's so funny because I think they met a small handful of times in Grand Slam finals. I'm not sure. It might have been 4.
They played 40 times, so about half of what Chris and Martina played.
Yeah, and they met in Grand Slam finals far fewer occasions than you would have thought. And they didn't go to each other's weddings, It's a funny thing because I just think that there's a uniqueness and extraordinariness to Chrissy and Martina's friendship. Chris Evert, I did not know this when I started reporting the piece. Chris Evert was maid of honor at Martina's wedding to Julia Lemakova in 2016. Maid of honor, that's extraordinary to me. I don't know of any other relationship like that ever in sports. That would be like, Magic being Larry Bird's best man or something. So I think these comparisons are actually, this is a one-off. I don't think there's anything comparable to this relationship in the history of sports that I can name.
And it's also what they went through for other women in sports. Yeah. It's also what Martina went through when she came out as gay. And Chris Evert defiantly, I think, in the face of the sports and tennis establishment, publicly supporting her. Then, as you point out in the story, other tennis players like Margaret Court from Australia called Navratilova a bad role model for being gay.
And early, Chrissy did it early. She did it as this, proper little Catholic teenager. She invited Martina to be her doubles partner. And today, Martina will tell you, Martina said to me on the phone, she said, it was huge. She said, it was absolutely huge for me. She said, I put her in the category of Elizabeth Taylor. in terms of being gay friendly early when it was not fashionable and the importance that had for gay people. That's the category she puts.
And the risk that could have created for her own career, sponsorships, relationships.
That it could have backfired. I mean, as Martina says, Chrissy underrates herself. Chrissy's very self-deprecating about all of this. But the fact of the matter is that Chrissy was an absolute stalwart, staunch friend to Martina on that issue always. I mean, it's Branch Rickey stuff, right?
This is a little bit beyond the scope of your piece, but Martina has been outspoken opposing trans women's participation in sports. Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense, based on your kind of deep knowledge of her, like gleaned over her long career, but also in writing this piece, kind of what motivates that? Because she was just such an important figure in terms of LGBTQ visibility and participation in sports.
Yeah, she's been Martina's been a human rights champion. I mean, don't forget, she championed Renee Richards. She hired Renee Richards as her coach for a while. I mean, she's had a deep experience with a close trans friend. She is nobody's bigot by any stretch. I don't agree with her. I think the science is highly unsettled. I am uncomfortable with categorical statements on this issue. So I'm just going to preface everything I say by saying, these are not my views on this issue. My views on this issue are still evolving on elite trans women in elite sport. Martina believes that there is a body of science that shows there is an undeniable legacy advantage from testosterone. It's a science-based. She believes that the sports issue is separate from every other human rights aspect. She supports trans people in every endeavor that she can. In this instance, she feels there is an issue of fairness at stake for women competitors. And that's simply what she believes. I can't say I agree with that, but it doesn't come from bigotry. That's what I can certainly say.
Before we let you go, Sally, I think we should ask you, how are they physically? Yeah. How is their treatment and where do they stand right now?
Yeah, I mean, they're cancer-free at the moment, is my understanding. They both have to get scanned quite frequently. I think every 3 months, every 2 to 3 months. Martina, I just spoke to her just before Wimbledon, and she had just been to Sloan Kettering and had a bunch of scans, and the scans results were good. So that was a relief. And I mean, that's what I know. I know they're both still coping with it. They both still have some challenges ahead, I believe, in terms of, recovery. They're tired. Quite frankly, they're still getting their strength back. That's what I would say. But, for the moment, cancer-free, and hopefully it remains that way for the duration. They were lucky. They caught it early, Chrissy especially got very, very lucky. Thank God the Cleveland Clinic had the research, had her sister Jeannie's results, had stored them, and was continuing to evaluate. And she got a phone call one day, and thank God caught the cancer in stage 1 instead of stage 4.
And that was ovarian cancer that her sister Jeannie had died from.
Yes.
The story is titled Bitter Rivals, Beloved Friends, Survivors. It's in the Washington Post. Everybody should go read it. We will post a link to it on our show page. The author is Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post. You should also check out her new book, The Right Call, What Sports Teach Us About Work and Life. Sally, thanks as always for coming on the show with us.
My real pleasure. It's always great to talk with you guys. Most interesting day of the week.
And that is all for our show for today. We'll be back with After Balls next week. But for now, our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. I'm Josh Levin. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.